Hi, welcome to the Leesburg Public Library virtually. Today we're going to hear from Tom Wilcox in another segment of Tom Wilcox Presents. And today is a fascinating background history that he's done extensive research on War of the Worlds and the excitement that it created and the panic that it created, or did it? So welcome and enjoy.
All right. Okay, well, welcome everyone. This January, we're going to do something special, and this is a program in conjunction with a library program that's going to show the War of the Worlds, the George Pal version, which was extraordinary in its special effects from 1953. But I'm going to do an earlier component because the book, The War of the Worlds, was written in 1897. And what I'm showing today is sort of the backstory to the Orson Welles Martian invasion War of the Worlds from 1938, because it actually was credited with starting something of a panic and in the United States. And of course, we're going to go into whether it actually did or not. And that's the title, War of the Worlds, How Orson Welles Panicked America, or Did He? So let's start. Okay, come on. There. Well, first of all, we have to go into radio. Radio was the mass medium of the time and had an extraordinary amount of influence. And that we're going to go into this later as to why it was promoted as something that caused a major panic, and why possibly it may have not have done it. But they had a power of persuasion that today is matched by the internet and television. And now Americans had a lot to worry about at the time, and this is also very important because there were reasons to cause anxiety. And as we know from television and social media, these are platforms that can amplify anything that people could worry about. And this was definitely true then. Now, there were also a lot of foreign threats. What was really happening at the time, people thought that the summer of 1938 would cause a major war in Europe, because Hitler of Nazi Germany laid claim to a German-speaking province of what was then Czechoslovakia. Today it is Slovakia and the Czech Republic. And maybe in history classes or on YouTube or something, you've seen Prime Minister not Winston Churchill, but his predecessor, Neville Chamberlain, coming at the airport and holding up an agreement. This was an agreement, it was called the Munich Pact, that he had reached with Hitler, where Hitler said he would not make any more territorial gains in Europe. And of course, he totally ignored that. A year later, he invaded Poland, which forced Britain and France to declare war. So people in the United States who were noticing, they were getting a little worried about that. What was more immediate was the economy. The Roosevelt New Deal programs had managed to put some 8 million out of 16 million people out of work. And that helped. The economy was growing, but it took a sudden dive in late 1937 and into 1938. And according to this is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, production declined by 37% to its 1934 levels. And the unemployment jumped from 14.3% to 19% by late 1938. And I don't think we've even seen numbers like that in the present pandemic year. I mean, that was pretty drastic. And that caused a great deal of anxious thinking among Americans. And it was sort of priming them for what was to come. And of course, people ask, well, didn't they know? When you turned on the radio, didn't you know that it was a program? And yeah, you did if you started at the beginning. But I found out that channel surfing was invented long before television became popular and before anything else where like remote controls were in existence. And at a very wrong moment, people just turned into the CBS network at the wrong moment. And we'll go into that a little more. I'm going to escape out so you can actually hear a little bit. All right. Now, if you turned in at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to listen, this is what you would have heard.
The Columbia Broadcasting System and its affiliated stations present Orson Welles and the Mercury Theater on the Air in The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells.
But that's not the way it actually happened for some people. And let's just open up the PowerPoint again. Okay, now, before we even get into that, the writer of this piece was Howard Koch, and they had quite a bit of consternation because what the program did, the Mercury Theater, they were considered to be a prestige project by the network. Wells and his company had been something of wunderkinds, and they had done things that nobody ever thought about. Unfortunately, only like the last 5 minutes is on YouTube, but they actually staged Macbeth and set it in Haiti. Quite remarkable. And things like that made CBS saying, well, yeah, they actually bragged. They brought a full theatrical company to the air. But that doesn't mean most of the books they dramatized were generally pretty okay, regular things like Jack London and things like that. But this was a real challenge because he tried working with the original H.G. Wells book, and he said he thought it was a very, very dull show. He didn't know quite what to do with it. And the only fallback, because radio was a live medium, so you had to have a script in a week, was Lorna Doone. And that had been abandoned, so he would have to rewrite that. And his secretary says, no one's going to listen to these silly old Martians. So even the secretary thought this really sucked. Now, here's the big competition. This is very, very important because their competition was the Chase and Sanborn Hour on the NBC network. And NBC being the first network, they started in 1927, 2 years before CBS, they managed to scoop up some of the biggest stars in existence at the time. And out of perhaps maybe 33 or 34 million radios in the US, they could easily pull in up to 17 million listeners. And whereas puny little CBS, Orson Welles, they could get maybe about 1 million steady listeners who liked literature. And but they were a powerhouse because their stars were Edgar Bergen and his dummy Charlie McCarthy, and they did all the comedy. Their singers were Nelson Eddy and Dorothy Lamour. Their announcer and also actor was Don Amici, who was a major film star in his own right. He had just completed In Old Chicago with Tyrone Power. And it was literally the most popular program that whole year. Okay, but this is where we get into the problem. Remember, we went back and said, why didn't people know it was a program? Well, at 8:15, the sponsor decided it had a scheduled break to advertise the coffee. And that's when a lot of people just spun the dial and they stumbled into something without any preparation that they had no idea what was going on.
Ladies and gentlemen, Marion. Ladies and gentlemen, here I am, back of a stone wall that adjoins Mr. Wilmot's garden. From here, I get a sweep of the whole scene. I'll give you every detail as long as I can talk and as long as I can see. There's more state police have arrived. They're drawing up a cordon in front of the pit. About 30 of them. No need to push the crowd back now. They're willing to keep their distance. The captain's conferring with someone. Can't quite see who. Oh, yes, I believe it's Professor Pearson. Yes, it is. Now they've parted, and the professor moves around one side, studying the object, while the captain and two policemen advance with something in their hands. I can see it now. It's a white handkerchief tied to a pole. Flag of truce. If those creatures know what that means, what anything means. Wait a minute, something's happening. A humped shape is rising out of the pit. I can make out a small beam of light against a mirror. What's that? There's a jet of flame springing from the mirror, and it leaps right at the advancing men. It strikes them head on. Lord, they're turning into flames. Now the whole field's caught up by the woods, the barns, the gas tanks for the automobiles, spreading everywhere. It's coming this way now, about 20 yards to my right.
Ladies and gentlemen, due to circumstances beyond our control, we are unable to continue the broadcast from Grover's Mill. Evidently, there's some difficulty with our field transmission. However, we will return to that point at the earliest opportunity. In the meantime, we have a late bulletin from San Diego, California. Professor Indelkoffer, speaking at a dinner of the California Astronomical Society, expressed the opinion that the explosions on Mars are undoubtedly nothing more than severe volcanic disturbances on the surface of the planet.
This is what I was telling you about, that at various times they sort of lifted you up to where, you know, everything was in hand, everything was going to be, we're going to work it out. And then they just pulled the lever of the gallows trapdoor and left you spinning into terror. And this was one of the actors. This is Ray Collins. He actually did two parts. He played the farmer who, the Wilmot farm where the cylinder landed. And it was really a very funny thing because he played to perfection someone who was thrilled to be on the radio but didn't know how to be it. And Carl Phillips is going, closer please, louder, trying to prompt him and everything. And later on, you'll hear him. And this is Frank Reddick, who played Carl Phillips, which you just heard. And actually how he got into it is that he was sent to Princeton to interview Wells, who was playing Professor Richard Pearson, an astronomer. And they did this wonderful sound effect. It was supposed to be the ticking of the clock controlling the massive telescope in Princeton, which Princeton never actually had. It was all bogus. But however, how they did that was they put a regular clock in a tin pail. It's just amazing the sound effects they used to make. And here's where we go. As you see, all these men are there, but the woman on the left is Ora Nichols. She was the only female sound engineer in all of network radio. This was an exclusively male preserve, and normally she would never have even been considered. I mean, women's place on radio was as actresses, but they also were a surprising amount of writers. There were quite a few writers who eventually became producers, like Erna Phillips. She produced The Guiding Light, which went right into the television era and existed for many, many years. And now we call them Foley artists, but she's the person who designed every single sound you hear on this broadcast all the way through. And this was one of them. The Martian cylinder is opening, and let's see if I can get to that, because you gotta hear this, because this is what her assistant, who I met, his name was Barney Beck. He said that his job on that broadcast they ran a wire down the hall to the men's room, and he was crouched over a stall toilet, and he was unscrewing a pickle jar to make the sound of the Martian cylinder. Yeah, we got to get to that.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, there's something I haven't mentioned in all this excitement, but it's becoming more distinct. Perhaps you've caught it already on your radio. Listen, please. Do you hear it? It's a curious humming sound that seems to come from inside the object. Right. I'll move the microphone nearer. Here. Now, we're not more than 25 feet away. Can you hear it now?
People said, did President Roosevelt speak? And there's a great story attached to this. This was one of the company, Kenny Delmar, who also played a character on the Fred Allen comedy program. He played this big voice Southern senator named Senator Claghorn. And but when he was on this one, and that was a great vantage for radio for actors. And I met quite a few people who had been actors, because since you couldn't see them, you couldn't tie a particular actor to a particular series. So they would just go from one series to the other. You know, if they had the time for it, they would do it. And some of the more popular people, they did several shows. They could probably clear up to $1,000 a week, which was, I mean, this was an era when a good salary was $1,000 a year. So some of these actors did well. And in this particular case, the CBS Broadcast Standards Department, who were the censors, they had 28 objections. Some of them were relatively minor, like for instance, they couldn't use the name of a hotel. So the Hotel Park Plaza in downtown New York does not exist. They couldn't use the Associated or United Press International wire services. So the Intercontinental Radio News was substituted instead. And they were very emphatic that the president could not speak. They were very, very definite on that. They actually have a script that said in big red letters, no FDR. So what they did instead, they had Delmar, and he was introduced as the Secretary of the Interior on the theory that nobody knows who the Secretary of the Interior is, but it sounds high enough to get onto the radio and talk about it. And supposedly Wells put out his arms and said, Kenny, you know what I like. And we'll have to, I'm gonna get out of this so you can see.
At this time, we take you to Washington for a special broadcast on the national emergency. The Secretary of the Interior.
Citizens of the nation, I shall not try to conceal the gravity of the situation that confronts the country, nor the concern of your government in protecting the lives and property of its people. However, I wish to impress upon you, private citizens and public officials, all of you, the urgent need of calm and resourceful action. Fortunately, this formidable enemy is still confined to a comparatively small area, and we may place our faith in the military forces to keep them there. In the meantime, placing our faith in God, we must continue the performance of our duties, each and every one of us, so that we may confront this destructive adversary with a nation united, courageous, and consecrated to the preservation of human supremacy on this earth. I thank you.
You have just heard the Secretary of the Interior speaking from Washington.
But it was very easy for Americans to believe that the president actually had spoken, although he wasn't identified, because they had been conditioned for 5 years. They had heard regular broadcasts from President Roosevelt. And even his own wife had a weekly radio program. So they were used to hearing from that administration, which they had never really had much access before. In fact, in the 1930 census, only 12 million Americans out of 124 million owned a radio. That's how rare it still was. And this is actually Wells conducting the cast, because he was directing it and acting in it at the same time, but you could do that on radio. And of course, the New Jersey State Police were thrown into total chaos. This is actually Norman Schwarzkopf Sr. If you're wondering, he is the father of the general that we know from the Gulf War. And he was the first director of the New Jersey State Police. And this is actually on this side, this is an Almay photo I had to use because I couldn't get it. This was a logbook that's still preserved in the State Police Museum in Trenton of all the calls they were getting that night. And we'll get into a little more like that later. And as you just heard, the CBS studios at 485 Madison was standing in as the broadcasting building. So they couldn't even name their own network. It had to be broadcasting building. And as you heard, Ray Collins was describing the Martian onslaught upon the city. And this is where they spotted, this is the Pulaski Skyway that the Martian actually was straddling, as you can see, and it's still there. It's quite a structure. It was built high to allow boats to get underneath it in the rivers. And now we're going to listen to one more thing, because when Wells was signing off, he's looking at the control room and he sees a line of NYPD blue coats waiting to end the broadcast to get their hands on him.
This is Orson Welles, ladies and gentlemen, out of character, to assure you that the War of the Worlds has no further significance than as the holiday offering it was intended to be. The Mercury Theater's own radio version of dressing up in a sheet and jumping out of a bush and saying boo. Starting now, we couldn't soap all your windows and steal all your garden gates. By tomorrow night, so we did the best next thing. We annihilated the world before your very ears and utterly destroyed the CBS. You will be relieved, I hope, to learn that we didn't mean it, and that both institutions are still open for business. So goodbye, everybody, and remember, please, for the next day or so, the terrible lesson you learned tonight. That grinning, glowing, globular invader of your living room is an inhabitant of the pumpkin patch, and if your doorbell rings and nobody's there, that was no Martian, it's Halloween.
Recommend listening to the whole thing. It's in fact, you sometimes have to actually listen to it more than once. And another sideline with Wells is that he was considered by fans to have the best male voice on radio, and the best female voice I found out was judged split between Eve Arden and Claire Trevor. But this is what John Houseman, he dryly said that the show came off, and meaning it was a big success. But in the control room, he got a call from one of the mayors of one of the big Midwestern cities like Omaha. He didn't specify which. And the mayor was just, his voice was literally choking with rage. He described, he had women and children sobbing in the churches, men running around the streets with guns, and the utility company turned off the power so that the Martians wouldn't see the city. And then he finds out it was just a radio program. He said he was going to personally come to New York to punch Orson Welles in the nose. Now, here's some things I found, contemporary references to it from the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, which is entirely digitized, and you could get it through the Brooklyn and New York public libraries. And this is some of the things they had to deal with that night. Said at Brooklyn Police Headquarters, calls poured in so fast that 8 patrolmen had to be added to the switchboard to answer anxious queries about the invasion. In Queens, people were calling the police asking, do you think the poison gas will reach us in Queens? Said a terror-stricken Flatbush man, that's back in Brooklyn, stumbled into the Vanderveer Park precinct last night to inquire if he should move his family and belongings out of Brooklyn. And this is a story from the Heartland that they picked up. And it says here, radio station KSL in Mormon, Salt Lake City report that hundreds of families packed their things hastily before fleeing, certain that Gabriel was back and that his horn soon would be blown. A puzzled old woman, informed that it was only a play broadcast over the air, thought about it for a moment and commented, well, if it doesn't do anything else, it sure made a lot of people pray tonight. And this is what John Housen described as a nightmare. Wells and the entire cast, they were held in sort of semi-custody, questioned by the police, questioned by the press to try and find out. And actually, he was very lucky because even though a nationwide inquiry was called, and this is also from the paper, FCC asked records of Mars invasion that shocked nation. And this was chilling news to CBS because the year before, the Chase and Sanborn Hour ran a skit between Don Amici playing Adam and Mae West playing Eve, that it literally lit up the switchboards with people calling. And many, many years later, Don Amici was in an interview and he said he really thought that doing a skit like that 2 weeks before Christmas on a Sunday night show was a big mistake, as it certainly proved to be. I mean, people were absolutely outraged by her sexy delivery. And actually, the person who, even Edgar Bergen remarked that we had to go in hiding for a week after that. And the only one who really long-term suffered, the FCC gave a reprimand to the NBC network, and poor Miss West was literally banned from network radio for about 14 years. And meanwhile, Arch Obler, who wrote the routine, Edgar Bergen, who, hosted the show, they all got off. But it was pretty bad when the FCC, they wanted a transcription record of the broadcast and a list of all the NBC affiliates who carried it. And it says even some of the very educated were fooled. They found Princeton finds witness, and this shows in quotes, said credulous, poorly educated persons were not the only ones taken in by the broadcast. At Princeton, an unidentified man rushed into the Princeton University Press Club and gave an eyewitness account of the rocket, which came millions of miles from which the invaders emerged. So, paranoia over the media is not limited to our own times. And even though in 1938, we didn't have the platform of misinformation we have today on the internet, social networking and everything, people had a good supply of telegraph cables and telephones to spread the word. And this is a US Senator saying that he called for an investigation. He also wanted legislation to ban such a program like that. And he said, radio has no more right to present programs like that than someone has in knocking on your door and screaming. So there was, according to this, the FCC received some 600 letters. The Mercury Theater received over 1,000. Something like 1450 letters, and the network got something like around 900 letters, people talking about it. So it exhibited a lot of conflict. And here we have our fake news. The New York Daily News got a Grover's Mill resident. His name was William Dock. And he lived right by the mill, which the building is actually still there. You could actually still see it. And he's posing, looking for Martians with his shotgun. And it's a lot of fun to see. And of course, now we get to the question, because in the beginning, I threw some doubt. Did it actually cause the panic that we were told it did? And a Princeton University psychologist actually started this whole thing. And what he found out was that he did this book called The Invasion from Mars, and he figured that they extrapolated out of all the people they interviewed that out of 6 million possible listeners, at least 1 million were bothered enough to do something about that. And that's been sort of called into question about the methodology. And here's an official complaint I got to read to you. This is from the city manager of Trenton, New Jersey. And he says that the broadcast had completely crippled communication facilities of our police department for about 3 hours. Says, and it said, he said in about 2 hours, all communication lines were paralyzed and voided normal municipal functions. If we had had a large fire at this time, it could easily have caused a more serious situation. Said, I can conceive of no reason why the name of Trenton and vicinity should have been used on this broadcast. The state police were equally handicapped. It is indescribable, the seriousness of this situation. But not all listeners really thought it was that bad. And here's what somebody said. This was a state administrative officer of South Dakota in their employment service. And he says, I suppose by this time you have received many letters from numerous cranks and crackpots who quickly became jitterbugs during the program. I was one of the thousands who heard this program and did not jump out of my window, did not attempt suicide, did not break my arm. And they had a picture in the Daily News. They called it a Martian invasion, but this poor hapless woman in her arm in a splint while beating a hasty retreat from my apartment, did not anticipate a horrible death, did not hear the Martians rapping at my chamber door, did not see the monsters landing in warlike regalia in the park across the street, but sat serenely entertained no end by the fine portrayal of a fine play. And you have to ask, was Wills prosecuted? Now, he was grilled by the police, but nobody could figure out if he had actually broken any particular laws. And of course, in a way, freedom of speech comes into this issue as well. And they said nobody had died that they knew of, although a woman in Providence, Rhode Island, she was so distraught that she attempted to take poison, but her husband stopped her. And another piece of salvation was the influential columnist Dorothy Thompson, and she was syndicated all over the United States. And she pointed out that it was good this program did that because it showed how completely unprepared the United States was for a real emergency. And Campbell Suits, they came to the rescue within 3 days. They turned from what they called a sustaining program where CBS actually paid for the production costs. They were just lapped up literally by Campbell Soups. And within a week, they became the Campbell Playhouse, and they kept it on the air. They kept Wells' name before the public, and he was able to sign a contract with RKO and bring him and his whole radio company out to the West Coast to make movies. And of course, the product that came was considered to be the most profound movie ever made in the United States, called Citizen Kane. And although he had a difficult relationship with RKO, his next picture, The Magnificent Ambersons, in order to get a key scene right, he made the studio hire an ice house and it was filmed in the ice house. And so Wells had this very uneven career after that, but he was always associated with the Martian broadcast. And now I've been reading a lot of different things, and like slate.com said in their opinion, the panic was created, and they gave a specific reason. They said that it was the newspapers who actually created much more of a panic than there actually was, because radio was cutting into their advertising revenues, and people were turning from newspaper. I mean, because one of the disadvantages of the newspaper is when there was breaking news, it took hours to produce an extra edition covering that news. And whereas radio, as soon as they heard about it, they could start reporting it, which is, as you heard on the broadcast, it sounded like real news as it was coming in. So they believe that it wasn't real. Snopes, they also agree, and these are two fairly unimpeachable sources. And I'm just going to leave it like that. Now, there's a lot of stuff out there. If you want to know more, the National Archives actually has several pieces of information, because, for instance, they have all of those letters that were written to the FCC. They're still in a particular record group in Washington, and all you have to do is do the War of the Worlds broadcast on Google, and you'll see hundreds of sites, podcasts, all sorts of things. I mean, I even saw it in a movie made during World War II, where this man is in a cab with his fiance, and they hear the news about Pearl Harbor, and the first thing she says is, "Oh, just ignore that, darling. It must be Orson Welles." And as a real treat, it's also on the internet. In 1940, Wells had a chance to be interviewed with H.G. Wells in a Dallas radio station, and they were just sort of really joshing at each other subliminally about the War of the Worlds, and they were having a high old time, like, wink, wink. It's a lot of fun to listen to. And in the end, this is actually the monument. You can go to Grover's Mill and see a monument. There was even a housing development built supposedly on the Wilmot farm in Grover's Mill, and that's how they were selling their houses. So it's one of those things, whether it caused a panic or not, it doesn't seem like it's ever going to completely leave us. But in closing, if you get the chance, go online and listen to the entire broadcast, because it's really, really remarkable. And you actually have to listen to it a couple of times to catch all the nuances. But I hope I gave you a flavor of it by playing certain selections. And thank you.